December 2nd, 1993. Medellin was on fire with chaos. The afternoon sun sliced through thick, black smoke from distant explosions. Red and blue lights reflected off crumbling buildings, illuminating alleys that smelled of dust, sweat, and blood. Sirens wailed, boots pounded staircases, radios crackled with tension. "He's on the roof!" shouted a voice slicing through the chaos. Gunfire erupted. Echoes bounced between walls. Above it all, a man ran across fragile clay tiles. Sweat streamed down his face. Each breath came ragged. Each step carried the weight of decades of terror. No army, no bodyguards, only him. This man, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, had built an empire of blood, cocaine, and fear. Presidents bowed, judges trembled, cities shook, bombs fell, thousands died. And now he was powerless. Another burst of gunfire, a body collapsed. Silence. But before the rooftop, before the chase, before the empire, there was a boy, a small child with dark eyes, born in 1949 in Rio Negro, near Medellin, Colombia. Pablo's father, Abel de Jesus Escobar, was a humble farmer. His mother, Hermilda Gaviria, was a schoolteacher. Their home was modest, dirt floors, a wooden table, a few worn books, but it was a world of lessons, of careful observation. From the beginning, Pablo watched. He noticed how people reacted to power, to fear, to money. He understood early that obedience was stronger than love and intimidation more effective than kindness. At 5, Pablo was already calculating. When neighbors quarreled, he noticed who cowered first. When someone lied, he observed the hesitation in their eyes. By 10, he realized the world ran on unspoken rules, and he intended to master them. Teenage Pablo was restless. He tested boundaries constantly. First, he sold fake diplomas to neighbors, claiming they would open doors to education that did not exist. He stole bicycles from friends, then strangers, measuring his skill and his luck. Small-time smuggling followed. Cigarettes, electronics, homemade contraband, quick cash, minimal consequence. Each act was a lesson in human behavior. By 16, he joined a local gang. Medellin in the 1960s was a city on edge, and the streets were a classroom of violence and opportunity. He learned how to read people, who would obey, who would betray, and how to manipulate fear as easily as words. Stealing became an art, extortion a game, violence a tool. Through these early exploits, Pablo discovered 2 truths. Power was intoxicating, and fear was its most efficient currency. He learned that small victories built reputation, and reputation built influence. The 1960s passed, and Pablo's schemes grew bolder. He was no longer a boy, but a strategist. Every theft, every smuggling job, every minor intimidation was a rehearsal for something larger. He became known in Medellin's underground as clever, fearless, and unyielding. By the early 1970s, the world shifted. Cocaine demand in the United States surged. From elite parties in Miami to nightclubs in New York to the streets of cities across the country, a market hungry for wealth, indulgence, and escape opened. Pablo saw this market not as a temptation, but as opportunity, a path to wealth unimaginable. Small shipments became larger. He learned to move kilos through jungle routes over rivers hidden in the hulls of boats. Jungle labs converted coca leaves into powder. He observed chemical reactions, lab efficiency, packaging, and transport. He became meticulous, almost scientific, in his approach. Planes flew low to avoid radar. Pilots learned his language of code, his signals for risk, escape, and speed. Each shipment was a test, each successful delivery a triumph, and failure, though rare, was a lesson in survival. The Medellin cartel was born, not chaos but a machine. Chemists, pilots, accountants, and armed men worked in harmony. Every function had purpose. Every failure cost lives. Kilos became tons. Millions became billions. Cash piled in warehouses. Some rotted. Some were eaten by rats. Once $2 million were burned to warm his daughter on a cold night. Luxury, necessity, and ruthlessness intertwined. By the late 1970s, Pablo's influence had grown beyond streets and labs. He became a figure of myth and fear. Neighbors whispered his name as both savior and monster. To the poor, he gave hope, houses, food, employment. To enemies, he gave death, sudden, precise, terrifying. He understood the delicate balance between generosity and terror, and he wielded it like a weapon. As his power grew, so did his ambition. He began planning estates that defied imagination. Hacienda Nápoles became a symbol of excess, exotic animals from across the globe, artificial lakes, private football fields, luxurious homes, a private zoo. Yet outside the walls, Medellin suffered slums, disease, hunger. He bridged worlds, savior to some, demon to others. But every empire has its rules, and Pablo's was simple, brutal, plata or plomo, silver or lead. Accept the bribe or accept a bullet. Judges assassinated, police hunted, rivals eliminated. Car bombs destroyed buildings, whole families' lives reduced to statistics. In 1989, Avianca Flight 203 exploded in a failed assassination attempt. Innocent civilians fell from the sky. Terror was now his language, fear, his currency. Colombia descended into war. In this part of the story, Pablo was no longer merely a smuggler. He was a politician, a negotiator, a man whose name could open doors and close graves. Yet, ambition carries consequences. Exposure came through media scrutiny. Political career ended. Humiliation replaced authority. From that moment, his conflict with the state escalated, intensifying into a war that would engulf Colombia for years. One phone call to his son betrayed him. Coordinates traced, rooftop, gunfire, collapse, silence. But every empire has its. By the late 1970s, Pablo's empire had grown beyond imagination. Small shipments that once tested his cunning had now become tons of cocaine, moving through the jungles of Colombia, across oceans, and into the hands of thousands of addicts in the United States. Each operation was precise, calculated, and ruthless. Planes flew at night, skimming the mountains, carrying crates labeled with code names. Boats traveled hidden routes across the Caribbean. Jungle labs churned day and night. Men in masks worked tirelessly, converting leaves into white powder that would fund unimaginable power. Pablo observed it all. He learned the value of loyalty and betrayal, of timing and fear. A single wrong move could destroy years of work. Every employee was a piece of a machine, and every machine had one rule: efficiency above morality. The Medellin cartel was no longer just a network. It was a corporate empire of crime. Chemists, pilots, accountants, enforcers, everyone had a role. The streets of Medellin were quiet in comparison to the roar of his warehouses, the hum of the planes, the steady flow of money. Kilos became tons, and billions flowed like a river that could not be stopped. But wealth alone was never enough. Power demanded spectacle. Escobar built Hacienda Nápoles, a sprawling estate that defied imagination. Exotic animals roamed freely. Hippos that grew massive in Colombian rivers, zebras, elephants, flamingos, all living under the shadow of one man's vision. Artificial lakes reflected the sunlight, football fields hosted lavish matches, and private jets lined the airstrip. Parties went on for days, filled with laughter, music, and the unspoken knowledge that outside these walls, the world was burning. Yet for all its beauty, Hacienda Nápoles was a fortress of strategy. Every gift he gave to the poor, every house, every donation was a message. Loyalty to Escobar came with protection, while betrayal came with death. Generosity was as dangerous as violence. Both carried his signature. The 1980s marked the era of plata o plomo, silver or lead. Bribes were offers of safety. Refusal was death. Judges who defied him vanished. Police who opposed him were executed. Rivals disappeared without trace. Car bombs destroyed buildings, families, lives. Fear became currency, and Pablo was its richest man. In 1989, he orchestrated his most notorious attacks, Avianca, Flight 203. The plane exploded in the sky, innocent civilians falling to their deaths in a gruesome display of terror meant to send a message to politicians. The world watched. Colombia shuddered. Escobar's name became synonymous with violence, genius, and audacity. Despite his reign of terror, he understood optics. He mingled with politicians, entered Congress, and presented himself as a philanthropist, a man of the people. Cameras clicked, newspapers printed his smiling face, and yet, behind the smile lay a mind calculating, manipulating, and planning the next strike. Humiliation came fast when the media exposed his criminal past, and political power slipped like sand through his fingers. The world began to close in. United States pressure mounted. Colombian authorities intensified their hunt. By 1991, Escobar made a choice: surrender on his terms. But even surrender was a strategy. He constructed La Catedral, a prison of luxury designed for himself. Football matches, lavish dinners, and private parties were conducted inside. Guards were loyal, walls were symbolic, and business continued unhindered. He had created a prison without confinement, but loyalty has limits, and freedom has a cost. Authorities attempted to transfer him to a real prison. Escobar vanished. The hunted became the hunter. Every alley, every rooftop, every shadow was a potential threat. Special search block units, along with intelligence agencies, closed in relentlessly. Los Pepes, a coalition funded by rivals and enemies, hunted his associates and finances. Safe houses were discovered, allies betrayed, and the empire began to crack. Every decision carried consequence. Every phone call could be traced. Every step could be his last. Pablo moved constantly, aware that his life depended on cunning, speed, and sometimes sheer luck. Amid the terror, Escobar's personal life was a paradox. He loved his family with a devotion that was almost absurd in the context of his violence. His children were protected, his wife shielded from harm as much as possible. Yet, every act of protection was a risk. Every moment outside the public eye was a gamble. His mind was a battlefield of paranoia and love, strategy and fear. The empire's reach extended beyond Colombia. Money flowed into foreign banks, offshore accounts, and real estate. Each transaction was calculated. Corruption spread like wildfire. Local officials, police, judges, even foreign diplomats, all entangled in his web. Escobar understood the world's levers of power better than most politicians. He manipulated with the precision of a chess master, yet every move required absolute control of those around him. As his power grew, so did the violence surrounding him. Medellin became a city of ghosts. Families hid, streets emptied, bombs exploded without warning. Inhabitants learned to obey, to pay, to whisper. Escobar's name was a curse and a protection, depending on who you were. And everywhere the shadow of his empire loomed, larger than life, impossible to ignore. And yet, for all his planning, the human mind has limits. The paranoia, the constant motion, the endless threats began to weigh. Sleep was scarce, trust was rarer, friends vanished, allies betrayed. The empire, immense and sprawling, was under siege from within and without. The boy who once calculated bicycle thefts now calculated death and betrayal with equal intensity. Every phone call, every message, every delivery became a risk. His life was now a constant game of survival, a delicate balance between brilliance and destruction. The man who once controlled cities now navigated shadows, always moving, always listening, always ready to vanish. By late 1992, the empire was fracturing. Los Pepes intensified their attacks, allies fled, finances were compromised. The Colombian government, supported by intelligence from the United States, closed in with unmatched coordination. Each day became a countdown. The hunter had become the hunted in a world where every mistake could mean death. By 1993, Pablo Escobar's empire was unraveling. The Medellin cartel, once untouchable, was under siege. Los Pepes had decimated his allies. Safe houses fell one by one. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Every phone call was a risk, every shadow a potential death trap. Even the boy who once stole bicycles now understood the fragility of life. The streets he had ruled for decades were closing in. Colombia had changed. The city that had trembled at his name now hunted him with unrelenting precision. Pablo moved constantly, shifting between rooftops, hidden safe houses, and jungle hideouts, each step calculated, each glance over his shoulder a silent reminder of mortality. He could feel the empire slipping, not from lack of power, but from the inevitable consequences of a life built on fear. At times he retreated into memories, childhood streets of Rio Negro, the small house of his parents, lessons of patience, observation, and cunning. But nostalgia offered no protection. His mind was a battlefield of paranoia and brilliance. He reflected on loyalty and betrayal. Friends had vanished. Allies had been killed or turned. Even those who remained were shadows of trust. The empire he had built on fear now relied on constant vigilance. Fear, once a tool, became a chain. Wealth, once limitless, could not buy safety. Meanwhile, law enforcement tightened their net. Special search block units trained and funded with US intelligence closed in. Air surveillance tracked his movements, intercepted communications, betrayed patterns. Every ally interrogated became a potential lead. The boy who had manipulated fear now faced the ultimate adversary, inevitability. Inside his mind, Escobar played a game of survival, strategies layered upon strategies, escape routes mapped, bribes allocated, diversions created. Yet, with every plan, the margin for error shrank. The hunter had become hunted, and the price of a mistake was death. Then came December 2nd, 1993. The rooftop, the coordinates traced from a phone call to his son. The city beneath him, once his kingdom, became a battlefield. Police swarmed the area, sirens slicing through the thick Medellin air. Guns fired, echoes reverberated through narrow alleys. The boy, who had calculated every move, now faced a force beyond calculation. He ran across fragile clay tiles, heart hammering, sweat streaming, bullets tearing through the air around him. Every jump, every landing, every breath a gamble. And then, a single shot. The world held its breath. Pablo Escobar collapsed. The Medellin cartel, vast and ruthless, fractured instantly. The empire built over decades dissolved in weeks. Colombia began to rebuild. Streets filled again. Families emerged from hiding. The shadow of Escobar remained, but the man was gone. Yet, his legacy was complex, almost impossible to categorize. He was a yet. His legacy was complex, almost impossible to categorize. He was a father, a husband, a strategist, a criminal, a philanthropist, a monster. Hippos still roam Hacienda Nápoles, a reminder of his excess. Children inherited wealth and notoriety. Books, documentaries, and studies analyzed his genius, his terror, and his paradoxical humanity. Pablo achieved unimaginable power, but he paid the ultimate price. He died alone, stripped of control, empire, and the illusions of immortality. The world had learned an eternal lesson. Power built on fear is temporary. Influence is fragile. Even the strongest, the smartest, the most feared, cannot escape the consequences of a life forged in violence. And yet, in his darkness, there was brilliance. A mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. A man who commanded loyalty, terror, and attention with equal skill. A boy who became a king, and a man who fell because the kingdom he built was made of shadows. Colombia remembers him not just for his crimes, but for the era he shaped. A period of unimaginable wealth, terrifying violence, and haunting human stories. Historians debate his legacy. Psychologists analyze his mind. Economists study the flow of illicit funds he orchestrated. And storytellers retell his saga, each narrative painting him as both genius and monster. Even today, his influence echoes. New cartels rise inspired by the structure he created. Enforcement agencies develop strategies learned from his tactics. Cities remember the terror, yet also the bizarre generosity that made him a complex figure to those who lived under his shadow. In death, he became immortal, not as a saint, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. The boy who once calculated every small theft, every minor act of rebellion, had now taught the world the price of unchecked ambition. Every empire falls, every king dies. And for Pablo Escobar, the final rooftop was the last lesson. The echoes of gunfire faded. Medellin breathed again. The world reflected. And the boy from Rio Negro, who had once stolen bicycles and learned the rules of fear, was gone. Power, wealth, and terror had consumed him. And in the silence that followed, humanity remembered the cost of chasing absolute control in a world where morality is negotiable and fear is currency. And so ends the story of the greatest Pablo Escobar. His empire is gone, but his legend remains. The story is over, and history remembers.